Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So welcome to this second lesson of this first semester, and what we're going to be discussing today essentially are a continuation from yesterday. We're going to be discussing the various different groups that have been around, that had come and gone, and essentially what they represented was the various different deviancies that would come into Islam, right, and had come into Islam. And I would argue that this is not something that is only unique to Islam, that we've got heresies and sectarian groups. I mean, I think every faith tradition, right, that that was a true faith tradition at one point or the other, they would have something of this nature, because you're going to have people who take the corpus that is coming down from the Prophet, and what they would do is some would go to extremes or exaggerate some of it. Some would have other shortcomings, and some would diminish it. Some would not practice enough of it. So these are you'll see when we discuss each of these groups, the Karramiyya and the Mu'tazila and the Qadariyya and the Shia. We're not going to discuss the Shia in detail here, but they were Qadariyya as well. People who denied free will, or who denied, not denied free will. The Jabariyya denied the free will, but the people who considered free will to be such that God, doesn't have a decree in certain cases. So we're going to be discussing the Karramiyya and the Mu'tazila and the Murji'ah, and then we're going to discuss the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Right? We're going to discuss the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Who exactly is the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah? We're also going to quote to you, inshallah, from many of the prominent scholars of the past, right? Historians and scholars and heresiographers, what is said about the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, who we spoke about yesterday, and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, and what they represented, and how many people pretty much were on their view, and did they represent the majority or not. That's essentially what we're going to be speaking about today in the class today, inshallah. So inshallah you'll be able to understand that. So by the end of it, we'll get a decent understanding of the problems, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. We'll see you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. We're discussing the Qadariyya. This was another group, and the Qadariyya, the word Qadar comes from the concept of divine decree, divine predestination. So the Qadariyya is kind of interesting why they call the Qadariyya. The Qadariyya are libertarians. I mean, that's one title for them. They're proponents of absolute free will. So their ideology is it's kind of overall overarching ideology, and the Shia, many Shia are actually Qadariyya. The Mu'tazila were Qadariyya as well. So it's kind of a more it actually refers to a very specific ideology. Mu'tazila was actually a sect that held many deviant ideologies, and one of them was the Qadariyya ideology. Likewise, many of the Shia, they actually hold a Qadariyya ideology as well. So you still have Qadariyya today in a sense, right? The concept of Qadariyya. So what exactly are they? So Qadariyya, they usually deny that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates evil. So they're thinking that how can you attribute evil to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So everything in the world is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything in the world, as Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah, we believe that everything in this world is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That means everything that happens in this world, whether it be good or bad, it all comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, it doesn't happen, bad does not happen in this world with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's approval, but because people have free will and Allah has created free will, that's why it happens. However, they could not, the Qadariyya could not reconcile this, so they said that evil acts have to be attributed to the man directly. Right. Of course, we also say that they're attributed to man in a sense, right? However, we've got a more complicated way, a sophisticated way of looking at that, which we'll look at later. So there's been a whole gradual stage in the Qadariyya. The initial Qadariyya, There were Qadariya that essentially considered that all human actions actually come from human beings themselves and they don't come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but obviously that's a blasphemy. So then many of the later Qadariya, they said that only the evil actions can't be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything else can be attributed to human beings themselves. So anyway, that's Qadariya, right? Now, usually Qadariya should be those people who actually agree with divine decree. That's what you usually call people when you attribute a name to a particular idea, then the idea is that those people must be proponents of Qadar or divine decree. This is kind of more like a negating classification here, where they call Qadariya because they actually deny Qadar. They deny the divine decree that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who does everything and has planned everything from in advance and so on. Now let's move on to the Khawarij. The Khawarij are very different, to be honest. They're very different. Khawarij or Khariji refers to separatists or seceders. The Khawarij were probably the first group or the first sect to split from mainstream Islam in the time of Ali radiallahu anhu. This happened, I mean, if you know the history of it, it's very interesting history, very ugly history. There was some conflict between Ali radiallahu anhu and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, and then an arbitration took place within that. Within that conflict, there was an arbitration that took place. And there was a small number of pietists who separated from them at that time, saying that we don't agree with this. We think that this has gone against the Quran. Whereas people like Abdullah ibn Abbas and others were there to say, no, this was completely fine. This was correct. This procedure was correct. So anyway, there was a small group of pietists. They withdrew to a village, the village of Harura. So that's why they call Haruris as well, because they moved to this village of Harura under the leadership of this guy called Abdullah ibn Wahab al-Rasibi. And then they were joined near Nahrawan by a larger group, right? And eventually this was the group that was responsible for the assassination of Ali radiallahu anhu. So they tried to assassinate all three of the major players of that time, which means Ali radiallahu anhu, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, and Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. They only succeeded in assassinating Ali radiallahu anhu. There was a failed attempt to assassinate Muawiyah radiallahu anhu and Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. They did actually attack Muawiyah, but he survived. Whereas Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu wasn't able to go for Fajr that day because he wasn't feeling well, from what I recall, right? Now, these are more extreme than the Mu'tazila. Remember, I mentioned that the Mu'tazila, anybody who commits a major sin, they are not Muslim anymore, they're not mu'min anymore, but they're not kafir either. They're in between the two, but they're still going to be in hellfire. The Khawarij, they say they're not believers, they're actually kafir. So anybody who commits a major sin is actually a kafir according to them, is a disbeliever according to them. So they're much more extreme in that sense. There were some, what we have to remember is that while they were the Kharijis of that time, we probably have Kharijis, in over the course of history. Usually people who go overboard in trying to consider others kafir on small issues and so on, the whole takfir game and so on and so forth, that's usually what leads to a Khariji mentality. So we have this Khariji mentality, throughout history, and even recently, in the recent past, there's groups that we have seen with this kind of extreme mentality where they will go and kill a lot of Muslims and so on, and so on. So that's the Khariji mentality. Then there were other groups as well, like the Jabariya. Okay, we had the Jabariya. Now the Jabariya are the absolute opposite of the Qadariya. The Qadariyas were deniers of free will, saying that human beings are creators of their own action, or at least their evil actions, and they take some of that away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the Jabariya are the absolute opposite. They're fatalists, right? So the belief of the Jabariya or Jabarites is that man has no free will at all. Man has no free will in his actions. Man is under complete compulsion, or Jabr as they call it. Jabr means compulsion. The example that's given is just like a feather. Just like a feather is at the mercy of the winds, or a leaf is at the mercy of the winds. Likewise, human beings have no choice, even in their intentional actions. All right. Now, the Jabariya, again, all of these groups, they could have split up into many other groups. So there's a subgroup of the Jabariya who were called the Jahmiya. All right. Now, let's look at the Jahmiya. The Jahmiya were specifically followers of Jahm ibn Safwan as-Samarqandi, who died in 128 Hijri, 745 Gregorian. And they were, of course, pure fatalists, pure Jabariya. Jabariya or Jahm expressed his heretic beliefs in Tirmidh. Tirmidh is a border town of present-day Uzbekistan, a border with Afghanistan. He was eventually executed there by the Umayyad governor of Balkh and Juzajan. Balkh is actually in Afghanistan today, right over the border. Then there was, like the Mu'tazila, he also rejected the eternal divine attributes. And he had a number of other heretical beliefs. I mean, it's really bad. So I think one of the examples given is that he was one of the first to say that the Quran was created, right? Having learned this idea from a Damascene teacher of his called Ja'ad ibn Dirham, who also died in 124 Hijri, Another belief that's attributed to him is that paradise and hell are temporary. They will eventually end. The Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah believe based on the Quran that they are forever, because people will stay in there forever, those who are not to come out again. However, Jahm has become a bit of a swear word, right? So there's a lot of false beliefs attributed to him. And sometimes people use the term Jahmiya as an insult to hurl against one another, right? Anybody who's got a disagreeable opponent, they just call him a Jahmiya, right? So one has to be very careful who they call a Jahmiya today, right? Then finally, I think we're going to quickly just talk about the Karramiya. Karramiya is led by a person called Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Karram, who died in 255 Hijri, 868. And these people, they were more mujassima, anthropomorphists. So they actually believe some things like Allah is resting on his throne and giving a physical direction to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and things like that. So they are more mujassima or corporealist, right? They believe in a physical God of some sort. The next group is the Murji'ah. The Murji'ah are diametrically opposed to the Khawarij. And this is a really interesting thing that we have to understand, is that again, these are all human extremes and failings and weaknesses and so on. So you've got the group of the Khawarij who are extreme in rendering people disbelievers and kafir and so on and so forth. You're going to have somebody respond to that. Now, people who respond to that, some people are going to be in between, Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, who keep everything balanced, but then there's going to be a group that go all the way to the other end to try to reject everything the Khawarij says. They become Murji'ah. The Murji'ah comes from the concept of irja. Now, irja means to postpone something, to defer something, to push something back, to relegate something and not consider it that important. They can also be called a posh word antinomians. I mean, you've had these in other faith traditions, other religions as well. These are people who are innovators who claim that disobedience is not very harmful. So they're not very adherent. They just say that as long as you have faith in your heart as such, that God will forgive all sins, as long as one has faith. So they say that sins don't harm you as much as, what the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah would say. So as I said, that's the absolute opposite of the Khawarij who are willing to make takfir of people. These are people are saying that, oh, let people come in, it's okay, don't judge anybody, that kind of an idea. So as I said, that was a group that had come out in response, and we don't have a formal group like that who call themselves Murji'ah today. However, as you will see, there's a lot of people with that tendencies. I mean, a lot of progressives, a lot of reformers would have this idea where they want to just water down everything. Now, when it comes to all of these groups, as I said, they all represent a kind of a generic failing or an extreme or an exaggeration or a shortcoming within human within human beings to take on, or in the way they take on certain ideologies. Some people go to the extreme, some people have an issue with certain things, some people are really fixated on a particular idea, while others are not. So that's essentially what happens. So So as I said, while these groups don't necessarily exist anymore today in their formal ways that they were, and some of them had a bit of power at some times, while others weren't very strong, and so on, their generic ideas are still around, right? And you still see people holding some of these ideas. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us something very important, which is the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. I'm going to relate to you the hadith which Imam Bayhaqi has transmitted, and so have others. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, it's very relevant to this actually, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this sacred knowledge will be born by, meaning held by and preserved by, the reliable authorities of each successive generation, who will preserve it and remove from it the alteration of the excessive. Those people who create excesses, Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people in the middle, will always purify that. They'll also remove from it the interpolations of the corrupt and the false interpretations of the ignorant. So that's a very, very important hadith for us to understand. Now let's move on from there to the actual Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So I'm going to describe to you who the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah is. Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Ahl means the people. As-Sunnah means obviously the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Ahlus Sunnah, the way, the people of the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wal Jama'ah, and the group. Group here could refer. It definitely does refer to the Sahaba, and then every successive group after them who are on that manhaj. I think it's very, very important because many of the Shia don't agree with all the Sahaba. In fact, many of them actually reject the majority of Sahaba, right? Saying that only a certain number were correct and reliable, and all the others they sold out or they were corrupt or whatever the case is. So Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah always represents the correct view. So just to recap, we had the Ash'aris, we had the Maturidis, and we had the elect group of Hanbalis who all were on the same madhab. Now if we were to look at history, right, to understand who represented the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah in history, you will actually find out that it's the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, and the group of Hanbalis, right? If you look among hadith scholars, hadith masters, exegetes of the Quran commentators, fuqaha, jurists, usulis, mutakallimin and theologians, people of the language of Arabic and of history, and so on and so forth, and the Sufis and reformers and the Sufis and those who showed the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will see that there were hardly any beyond the pale of being Ash'ari, Maturidi, or from among the good Hanbalis that followed Imam Ahmad's view. So let me give you a few quotes just to kind of clarify all of that and show what others have said about it. If we take Tajuddin as-Subki, one of the great historians and Shafi'i jurists, he says that these Hanafis and Shafi'is al-Maliki, so هؤلاء الحنفية والشافعية والمالكية وفضلاء الحنابلة, and these elect Hanbalis, وَلِلَّهِ الْحَمْدِ, with the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فِي الْعَقَائِدِ يَدٌ وَاحِدَةٌ, in aqaid, when it comes to beliefs, they're all on the same platform. كُلُّهُمْ عَلَى رَأْيِ أَهْلِ السُّنَّةِ وَالْجَمَاعَةِ, they are all upon the view of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. يدينون الله تعالى بطريق شيخ السنة والجماعة أبي الحسن الأشعري. They pretty much all consider the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be in accordance to what was laid out by the Shaykh of the Sunnah and the Jama'ah, which is Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. They hardly any of them have diverted from that, except a small group of Hanafis and a small group of Shafi'is who became Mu'tazila, and another group of the Hanbalis who joined with those who would attribute human form and other things like that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, essentially the Mujassima, right, which who are people anthropomorphists. And he then says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has really preserved the Malikis because you see hardly any of them deviate, right, away from the Ash'ari view. Now he clarifies something very important, because some people try to say Ash'aris, why do you call them Ash'aris, right? Why is that term even used? Why don't you just call them Muslim? Look, this is a point of development. So what happens is that Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, as we spoke about in the previous lesson, he was a Mu'tazili, and then after that he became proper Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah and started to defend the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the orthodoxy, against the heterodoxy of i'tizal, of the Mu'tazila. So what he did was, he did not come up with any new idea. He did not start a new madhab himself or anything like that. All he was doing was literally just highlighting the madhab of the Salaf, the madhab of the pious predecessors, right? Just defending what the Sahaba had given to us from the Prophet ﷺ and transmitted down. That's all it is. That's all it is. The only reason people are called Ash'aris is because he became a mouthpiece for the Muslims against all of these problems, the Mu'tazila and so on. So then eventually when he started to defend and he started to highlight certain points which were known before, but they just weren't put together in that way because we didn't have this challenge before. So when he just put all of this together, this corpus, it became like a discipline, right? So that's why when people are attributed to that, it means that they're just Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That's all. That's essentially what it is, right? So for example, another great scholar of ours, Shaykhul Islam Izzuddin ibn Abd Salam, Allahu Akbar, what a name. He says that the Aqidah that was laid out and highlighted and especially codified like that by Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, that is who the Shafi'is, the Malikis, the Hanafis and the great Hanbalis, the group of the Hanbalis, that is what they follow. And he gave names. For example, he said that if you look at the Shaykh of the Malikiyya of his time, of the time of Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, Abu Amr ibn al-Hajib, Shaykh al-Hanafiyya, Jamaluddin al-Hasiri, all of these followed the same opinion. Then you have another statement from Ibn Asakir al-Dimashqi, rahimahullah. He says, أكثر العلماء, the overwhelming majority of ulama in the various different areas, they are upon it, meaning the madhab of the Ash'ari. The imams of the various cities, right, in all times and places have always attributed themselves to Ash'ari, right? Whether they call him Ash'ari school or not, but because he kind of put it all together for them. He says, are there any of the fuqaha of the Hanafis and Malikis and Shafis except that they are on that same view, attributing himself to that same view or praising him? They are all on that view. They are all on that view. That's essentially what he's saying, that they are all on that view. They pretty much, you'll hardly find anybody who was not Ash'ari or Maturidi or a proper Hanbali. We move on to another view of Ibn Asakir al-Dimashqi. He also says that وَلَسْنَا نُسَلِّمْ, we don't agree that Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari started any new madhab, a fifth madhab, from the madhab of the jurists, for example. All he did was that he was the one who stood up to respond to all of these people, and everybody else started to attribute themselves to his view, because that was the view that you could say distinguished the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah from all the innovators. So because we don't live at that time, because we did not witness that time, a lot of people have this issue. Why would you call yourself Ash'ari as well? If you were living at that time, then it was Ash'ari who was at the forefront of the defense of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah against all the sectarians and the heretics and the heterodox groups. So if you were to say in a single word what you are, because everybody called themselves Muslims, the Mu'tazila called themselves Muslims and the Khawarij called themselves Muslims and so on. So if there was one word that would tell somebody that you are on the view of the Sahaba and so on, right, as known as orthodoxy, then you would say that I believe in whatever Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari taught. That's essentially what it was. But now that when we look at it in hindsight, and where this discussion of Imam Ash'ari and nobody knows about his life and so on, it makes it sound like he's some strange person, right? And the real way is another way, right? This is why the confusion comes around, because at that time, you had the different groups of the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiya and the Karramiyya and the Mushabbiha and the Salimiyya and a number of other innovators, right? Now, all of these people, it was Ash'ari rahimahullah who stood up there, right, in that Baghdad area, being the center of the Muslim world at that time, to reject them, to respond to them, and to basically uproot them. And if anybody was mistaken or confused, he was the one who gave them an understanding of what the true opinion was. So he managed to reform a lot of people. Now, we don't see that the four madhabs and the imams of the four madhabs have considered each other problematic or against, we see that they may have differed in terms of their view of how to do something in Islam, but in terms of the actual beliefs, we don't see any of them criticize one another for that reason, right? We see that when it comes to Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the transcendence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and to protect him from all forms of, or to repel from him all forms of deviant ideas, they're all together in that regard. And essentially Ash'ari was on their manhaj, and he was just you can say somebody who voiced the opinion. That's all he did. He just basically laid it out for everybody, which people knew before but didn't have to just vocalize in that way because there were nobody challenging it. So for example, let's go to a Yemeni scholar called Murtada al-Zabidi, right, rahimahullah. He says, it should be known that each of the two Imams, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi radiyallahu anhuma, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them on behalf of Islam an excellent reward. He says, they did not innovate from their own selves any new opinion, and they did not come up with any kind of new madhab. All they were doing, he says, is they were just supporting and confirming the madhab of the Salaf, and they were just defending what the Sahaba, their position was. And all they were doing was they were debating with any heterodox people who tried to go against that, people and innovators and people who were deviant, until, alhamdulillah, he says, until they all ended, and they basically turned on their heels and ran away. We've got another major heresiographer, right, a person who writes about the heresies within the Muslim tradition, called Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah. He speaks about Imam Ahl Sunnah Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. He says, the world, وَقَدْ مَلَأَ الدُّنْيَا كُتُبَهُ or kutubuhu mala ad-dunya. His books have filled the world, basically. He wrote many books. They went all around the world, and he says hardly any theologian besides him have been given so many followers. There are so many followers that follow him. There were many other theologians, right? Good theologians. But pretty much he has the greatest following because they follow him by name in that case. Aside from a small group of people who went their own way, he said, pretty much everybody else followed him, at least in the core principles. And some of his, we learn now from this quote, some of his well-known students were Abu al-Hasan al-Bahili, Abu Abdullah ibn Mujahid. These two were some very close students of his, and from them came many other students, and they basically spread this knowledge far and wide at that time. So this was the predominant predominant kind of movement of the time, right? You would not even doubt it at that time, unless you were heterodox. But today, because it's been such a long time and people haven't thought to think to speak about it as much, right? That's why there's a lot of confusion about it. Now, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, rahimahullah, from Shiraz, he says Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari is Imam of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and the majority of the scholars of the Shafi'i school are on the madhab, meaning they follow the same thing as Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari does. His madhab is madhabu Ahl al-Haq, وَمَذْهَبُهُ مَذْهَبُ أَهْلِ الْحَقِّ. His madhab, his school of what he has clarified and put together, is the madhab of the people of the truth. Now, Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah, you can't not know him, right? He wrote the 40 hadith collection, he wrote the Riyadh al-Salihin and so on, right? He says, in his biographical sketch of Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayini, right? So there's another great scholar whose name is Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayini. He says that وَكَانَ الْأُسْتَاذ, this Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayini was one of the three major scholars who came together at one time, meaning who lived at the same time, who were all supporters and defenders of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So these three scholars that he's speaking about, they were the major and foremost defenders of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah from all the heresies of that time, with regards to theology, right? Theological belief related issues. They were all defending the view of Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, meaning they were all defending his school, right? So who are these three? Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayni. You can say that they are the descendants, right? You can say the sacred knowledge descendants of Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari. So they are Abu Ishaq al-Isfirayni. Remember these names: Qadi Abu Bakr al-Baqillani and Imam Abu Bakr ibn Furak. Right? These are known to be the most amazing people and theologians. Their names come after Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, right? So there's another scholar of several centuries later, Abu Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, right? A great Shafi'i scholar. He was asked once about Imam Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari and Imam Baqillani and Ibn Furak, and then there's others who were not mentioned yet. There's Imam al-Haramain, Abdul Malik al-Juwaini, right? Imam al-Baji. All of these, you can say, continued this school, continued to expand it and discuss it even more and answer more questions. And all of them, they took from the madhab of Ash'ari, so that was their foundation. And so what did he think about them? He was asked the question. This is how he responded. He said, Hum a'immatud din, they're the imams of the deen. They are the great ulama of the Muslimin. It is wajib, he says, it is obligatory to follow them, because they're the ones who stood up to assist and defend the Sharia and to clarify the difficulties and the complicated issues that people are thrown at the deen and were causing people to go astray because of. And they're the one, and these are the people who responded to the people of deviancy, and so one has to follow them, because they had the knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what was necessary. So they extrapolated to people, meaning they explained to people what you had to believe about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what was permissible as a belief, what was not permissible as a belief, what was inconceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there were just so many questions were coming up on this. They're the ones who sat and clarified all of these things, right? Likewise, what do we have to believe about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and so on? All of that was discussed for them. Then he mentions a hadith which we quoted a bit earlier, that there's always going to be a group of people that's going to remove any excesses created by excessive people and so on and so forth. So he says that the only people that consider them deviant would be the stupid, jahil, ignorant, or the person who's an innovator himself, who's deviant from the truth, or who's a heterodox. Only those people would say that, right? And the only people who would say bad things about them would be a fasik and a transgressor. So that's why you need to, he says, clarify to the jahil and teach these people what the truth is about this. That's essentially who Imam Hasan al-Ash'ari rahimahullah was, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him and everybody else. Abu Mansur al-Maturidi. So assalamu alaikum. To conclude today's session, the concluding remarks that I have today is that to put it all together, the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyya, and who they refer to as the Fudala ul-Hanabila, which means the elect and reliable Hanbali scholars, and the Ahlul Hadith as well. These are the people that represented the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and that's who this word Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah was applied to. All of them. They were all included within that, right? So they were not separate from that, right? Now, the way we can understand this as a concluding point I want to make, I mean, you must have all heard of the Aqidah Tahawiyah, right? The Aqidah of Imam al-Tahawi rahimahullah, who is actually a contemporary, subhanAllah, is a contemporary of Abu Mansur al-Maturidi and Imam al-Ash'ari, right? And he dies around the same time, okay? And he does not have a madhab as such, but he's a Hanafi scholar, he's a Hanafi jurist, he has a number of books. And he compiles this really short Aqidah, and that has just basically become such an accepted work. It's such an accepted work. So pretty much all of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah after his time, right, once his book became known everywhere, they accepted his work, right? And they all agreed that what he has in there is absolutely correct, and that is what represents the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. If anybody's got any issue with any aspect of Aqidah Tahawiyah, that shows you that they've got a problem with the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? They've got a problem with the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That's why the Hanafis, Shafi'is, the Hanafis, Shafi'is, Malikis, and many of the Hanbalis don't have a problem with that. In fact, the way Imam Ash'ari, the way Imam Tahawi actually begins his book is that he says that I am writing this based on the Imams of the past, right? And this is what they considered to be the Aqidah of the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And he said that this is the view of Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man and his two companions, Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Yusuf Yaqub al-Ansari and Imam Muhammad al-Hasan al-Shaybani. So now, if you were to compare that with the Maturidi school and their books, you'll see that there is absolutely no difference between them. You'll hardly find any difference between them. They are just about exactly the same. So that is what it represents.